Hi, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for Inside Out Mastering Response Capability through Performance Mindset. I'm joined here by Kevin and Mike, we're excited to dive into this particular topic. Kevin has done extensive research in this area. He was a sports and performance psychologist, and really interesting to apply this in the realm of risk, response, compliance, and think about how our individual mindsets really shape the way in which we kind of spring into action in these scenarios. Just a quick agenda here before we get started. We're going to go through some quick introductions. We're going to dive into some strategies to develop a performance mindset, including diving into the 4 behavior quadrants, and explore how we can leverage different mindsets to drive response effectiveness. And at the end of that, we'll wrap it up. We'll take some time for questions, but really very excited about the subject today. I am Paula Fontana. I lead marketing here at iluminr. I'm joined here by, as I said, Kevin and Mike. Kevin, Mike, you want to take a couple minutes to introduce yourselves?
Sounds good. I can introduce myself. So I'm Kevin Alschuler. As Paula mentioned, I am a sport and performance psychologist. Sport and performance psychologists work with athletes, businesses, business leaders, and so forth on leveraging psychology and leveraging the mental game to get the most out of what we're trying to accomplish in our performance settings. And I've had the good fortune to work with a diverse array of athletes, from young kids up to older adults, number of professional athletes as well, on how to improve their mental game. But I've also had some good opportunities to branch out in business and in law. And what we found is a lot of the concepts that we like to cover in sport and performance psychology are broadly applicable. And that's what led us to all get to meet each other, and led to us deciding on today's topic as well, because it's certainly fitting in this space as well. So I'll look forward to getting to introduce some of that content to you in a few minutes.
I'm Mike Geier. I'm a director with BDO USA in the forensics group in the advisory team. I work with a lot of diverse clients as well across all industries. I really help bridge strategy and technology, so bringing together both of those 2 topics and really trying to help organizations maximize their investments in technologies to support their goals. Like Kevin, always looking to really kind of bring out the best in the teams that I work with. So looking to institutionalize some of the learnings that we'll look to get today, and kind of bring in the technology lens. So ways that we can support some of these approaches with technology. So really looking forward to the discussion.
Really very excited to dive into this particular topic, especially given I think we don't always consider maybe as strongly the human aspect of risk, response, compliance in driving not only performance, but effectiveness for organizations, particularly as we're seeing, think change on a pace that we've never seen before. So with that, I'm going to hand things off to Kevin, who's going to take us through the basics, and then we'll go through an interactive exercise with a microsimulation.
All right, fantastic. So I'm going to take a few minutes here to just kind of give you all an overview of one of the ways that I like to think about optimizing how people perform in really important situations, whether it's a high performance situation or a high stress situation. What I would say is that, the vast majority of people who seek me out for help are people who are coming and are saying, I know what I'm supposed to do in the heat of the moment. I know how I'm supposed to perform, but sometimes I do it and sometimes I can't. And, I think that piece is the same piece that brought the 3 of us together to do this today. That idea that it's one thing to teach people how to execute in the heat of the moment, but it's another to think, like, what helps facilitate actually executing what you want them to execute, and what gets in the way, or what pulls us away from executing the way that we want to execute. So one of the things that I've come up with over time is this very simplistic looking model that's in front of you, but we're going to use this model to explain a wide array of responses that people have when they're trying to execute a task in a key moment. So to orient you to this picture, this is a picture of any moment in time and where we are with our thinking and our focus in that moment in time. So if we look across the x-axis, from the left to the right, we have time. So the far left is, we might be thinking about things that are in the past, or in the farthest left would be the distant past. The far right would be the future, so things that are going to happen down the road, and farther out to the right, the farther in the future. Top to bottom, we have essentially how we're feeling about things. Are we feeling super positive, super optimistic, ecstatic, elated, or are we down in the dumps? Are we annoyed, frustrated, feeling dejected about the situation? Now you could line up, I don't know, we could have 100 sports psychologists on this call, and we could all talk about the mental game in a different way. But one of the things that we would all probably rally around as a unifying point would be that, in general, people perform at their best when they're focused on what they're doing right now. So having a present focus, so again, using that left to right, that would be in the middle of the x-axis. And while we might have some debates over how much emotion we want people to have in those moments, in general, we understand that while people might feel positive or they might feel negative, we want it within a manageable range at minimum, so that people are experiencing what they're experiencing in that moment, but without the emotions being so strong or so extreme that it's starting to pull us away. So some people would come in and say, to perform at your best, we want your people to be right at the intersection of these two axes, perfectly present and perfectly neutral in how they're feeling. I believe in humans not being robots, and so I like to assume that people might not be perfectly present or absent of emotion, and I think that's totally fine. That's part of the human experience. So what I always tell people is that, in general, we think you're going to perform at your best when you're somewhere around the middle of this model. And so that's the performing square that you see there. Now, I just referenced humans being humans. And one of the things we know is that we're not always in that performing space when we're at work, or we're out living our life, or we're playing sports, or whatever it might be. And when we're not in that middle space, we might drift to any of the four spaces that you see around the outside. So we might start thinking about something in the future that we're really excited about, like that this is going to go really well, or that we're going to, win, or we're going to succeed, or we're going to overcome this challenge. And so we start dreaming about this future outcome. We might start thinking about things in the future that worry us. Right? We might be afraid that this isn't going to work out, or we're going to have this problem, or we're going to face this challenge, or we're going to crash and burn, or whatever it might be. And we might also start thinking about things that have already happened. So the parallels there on the left-hand side. Maybe we're thinking about the last time we were in a similar situation and how it didn't work out. And we're regretting how that happened, and we're regretting how what happened in the past led to where we are today. So we're kind of stuck in that past negative. Or maybe that upper left hand, the reminiscing piece, where it went really well before, so I think it's just going to go well now, and I'm going to enjoy thinking about how great I was in my past, or how great these things went in the past. Now, as I talked about those, there was probably a tone in my voice that suggested that none of those four things are ideal. And I'll say, like, none of those four are ideal, and we'll talk about why. But I don't think they're all bad. I think it's good for people to have dreams. It's good, it's motivating, it's exciting. It pulls people forward to look forward to good outcomes. Worrying isn't all bad. We need to do some critical thinking about what might get in the way in the future so that we can pull some of that back into the present, make sure that we're planning and we're preparing and we're ready for some of those future challenges. We can learn from our past. So things that didn't go well, while they might bother us, they might also provide us an opportunity to learn something that we want to pull forward. And reminiscing is super important from the perspective of building confidence, building self-belief. It's good to be able to reflect back on positive experiences that we've had in the past that give us some confidence towards what we're doing today. So my goal when I'm working with anybody, whether it's an athlete or a team or a leader or a business, is to help people maximize their time in that performing square, maximize their ability to be in the middle of the model. And my goal isn't to eliminate everything else, because I don't think that we can, but I want to help people develop the skills to pull them to the middle so that they're there a maximal amount of time. So Paula, if you want to go to the next slide, from my perspective, there's three big things that we try to accomplish when we're helping our teams maximize that time in the middle of the model. The first one is we just want to get better at being in the middle of the model. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about some of the how-tos, and we're going to use a scenario to tease some of this out as well. But one of the big things is, can we help people understand who they are when they're at their best, what they're doing when they're at their best, what that feels like, how they can get themselves there? Can we train them to be able to stay there? I always tell our athletes, it's almost like strength and conditioning training. Like, can we help you be there longer in a stronger, more robust way? So one of our tools for maximizing the time that we spend in the middle of the model is simply to get better at being at the middle of the model. And while that one seems like a no-brainer, I've had countless experiences where I start talking about this with the group and I say, okay, so what is that performing square for you? And people don't have words for it. They're like, well, I know what I'm doing when I'm in that space, but I don't really know what that is. And I don't know, therefore, how to get there or how to stay there. And so teasing some of that out is really helpful for a lot of the groups that I work with, just from a defining it perspective. It's hard to shoot for something if we don't know what we're shooting for. If we go to the next slide, the second part of improving our ability to be in the middle of the model is to get better at understanding when we're not there and get better at being able to turn ourselves around and pull ourselves back. I get this from athletes all the time. I work with a lot of golfers. Probably a lot of you have played golf at some point in your life. And they'll tell me about a problem that they had on the third hole that bothered them till the seventh or the eighth hole, at which point they turned themselves around and got themselves back on track. And one of my goals is, can we get that down to the next shot instead of 5 holes later? But that takes also a certain amount of awareness and a certain amount of skill. Can you catch yourself? Can you identify when you're starting to drift out of that optimal space? And can you react to that or really respond to that in a way that allows you to efficiently make that U-turn and pull yourself back? And a lot of the work that we do, I think we all have this shared term of resilience. A lot of the work that we do around resilience is really built on that piece. It's built on our ability to turn ourselves around when things start going the wrong way. So in addition to being strong in that middle part, we need to be able to be aware or understand when we're drifting away and be skilled at pulling ourselves back to the middle. And then the third part of optimizing that time spent in the middle of the model is we need to address what's pulling us away. And in most of the groups and with most of the individuals I meet with, people, teams, organizations have tendencies. Like I've said to Mike and Paula, I know mine. I'm a worrier, right? So do I get stuck reminiscing? Probably not. I'm too busy worrying about what's going to come up next. And most of the people I meet with have one or two areas that kind of have this gravitational pull for them, whether that's who they are as a person or whether that's the organizational culture, there tends to be a pull. And so if we think that on one side, we're trying to really hold ourselves in the middle of this model, and then on the other side, we have something like worrying that's pulling us away, it's almost like we're in this constant tug of war. And so just like we're trying to make the performing square stronger, it's also important for us to chip away at what's pulling us in the other direction. So in my case, if I were to make my performing square stronger and my worrying square weaker, that tug of war is no longer a fair game. It doesn't mean that worrying won't always have some pull for me. Probably not, right? But if we can change the relative weight of the two, we can make it easier on ourselves to stay in that performing square. And so a lot of times, a big part of our work, just like with the defining the performing piece, is understanding like what is our problem, what is our challenge, for our group, for our team, for our organization, what are kind of those traps that we tend to fall into. And often, one of the things I think is really important, and I know Paula, Mike, and I were talking about this in the lead up to this, often it comes from a good place, right? We're talking about crisis response, like it's good to worry, right? Like we need to do a certain amount of planning and thinking ahead and preparing, but it's being able to identify how to kind of calibrate that at a level that's productive and that is useful for what we're trying to accomplish in the present moment,
Yeah,
as opposed to being something that pulls us away. Go ahead.
I was just gonna add to that because I know you've spoken on a previous webinar on COVID or pandemic response, and you kind of likened it to people's responses around the time of the pandemic, where you had some folks that, not necessarily thinking about the possible consequences of not having basic necessities like toilet paper at home, right? And then you had some that were over prepared and had stocked up, to the hilt with toilet paper, which ultimately had catastrophic consequences for, the broader ecosystem, the supply chain. So yeah, having that right-sized response, so it's not that worrying is bad, it's just worrying in appropriate amounts and being considerate for, taking under consideration the level of preparedness that you need to put into this particular scenario.
Absolutely. I should have brought the toilet paper slide.
It's a great slide.
I think it does balance, it does kind of lay out that balance, right? That when the supply chain was such that you couldn't find toilet paper at that point, you needed to be aware enough that your supply at home was running down because you couldn't just run out to the store to get some. But if you went out and bought $1,000 in toilet paper, you were probably costing yourself and society something that was unnecessary and was making the problem worse instead of better. So yeah, that was probably the one slide I've ever had that I don't think it went viral, but whatever is sub-viral, we'll go with. So I have just a little bit more on this, and then we'll maybe take it over to the scenario. But Paula, if you can flip to the next one, this might give you guys some ideas. Oh, we got some small text there. I'll give you guys some ideas of some of the things that we do to help help our teams or individuals get better in these areas that we're talking about. And so just as an example, with the worrying, right? One of the things that happens with worries and with fears is that instead of taking those as information, like we were just talking about, right, where we could do some planning and some preparing, we start to feel some pressure to resolve the fears, to resolve the worries, to eliminate these future problems. And it's often those elimination efforts that get in the way of what we're trying to accomplish in the moment. And as psychologists, one of the things we like to work on with people is trying to improve their willingness to just coexist with uncomfortable things. Be able to coexist with the idea that maybe we don't know how this is going to turn out. Maybe we don't have every answer. And being able to build that tolerance to coexist with the discomfort and allow that to be there while we get back to work and we get back to the task at hand, and not get stuck in trying to solve every potential problem, which puts all our energy into this search for solutions and takes us away from executing what we're trying to do in the moment. Do you want to go to the next one? There we go. So with regretting, this is one that I really like to talk about when we're in the resilience space. Regretting is one that tends to really hold groups back. When we start regretting, we start getting stuck. We get stuck in things that happened in the past. We get stuck in the things that frustrate us, stuck in the things that bother us. And like I said earlier, bad past experiences don't have to be bad. We can learn from them. We can grow from them, but we don't learn and we don't grow when we're stuck ruminating on them. And so being able to have good processes for taking those past events, taking those past experiences, extracting the lessons learned, and bringing those into the present so that we're better at performing is really the task that we're looking for. And again, what that requires is knowing what we're trying to get back to, right? Knowing what that performing square looks like so that we can pull ourselves back to that space. Paula, do you want to go to the next one? So reminiscing is obviously another one that can be derailing at times, and we're going to talk through some of these with the specific scenario that's coming up. But with the reminiscing piece, one of the important parts is that we can really grow our culture from having had past successes. We can grow our culture, our self-belief, our confidence in our ability to be successful at what we're doing right now based on those past events. But if we're too stuck in the past, we also get a little cocky, a little arrogant, right? Maybe not be as detail-oriented in the present. And so what I always work with people on is trying to understand, why were you successful in the past and what do you want to do now that helps you replicate what you did in the past, so that we're not trying to replicate the past outcomes or live off those past outcomes, but we're taking that recipe of what made us successful and we're drawing that back into the present. So if you're catching the flavor as I'm talking about each of these, a lot of it's about pulling the relevant pieces back into the present as opposed to being stuck in those outer areas. I think we maybe have a dreaming one, or we might have accidentally missed the dream. Oh, there it is. All right. So with dreaming,
forget
again,
the dreamers.
exactly. We want our workforce to be inspired, right? We want to be excited about what we're going to do. I want to be excited about talking about the dreaming square.
I think Mike is definitely a dreamer.
I was going to say,
if I'm going to be honest here.
And I would say, and this fits with Mike, I would say that if there's one way that I would tweak this model, I would say there's a fair amount of people who are at their best when they're oriented a little bit northeast of the center of this model. A little bit of optimism, a little bit of hope, a little bit of excitement. We might be best from a process execution standpoint right in the middle. But the reality is that slight drift to the upper right tends to really like add a little spark behind what we're doing. But if all we care about is the end outcome and it's going to be fine and things are going to be great, it's also easy to miss what we need to do right now. And so I always tell people, like, we want you to be inspired by that future outcome. But if it's, when I work with athletes, it's like if you're a rugby player and you're in an 80-minute match and you want to win in that 80th minute and it's the first minute, then we want to take all that excitement and that energy and so forth and bring it back to, all right, what can I do right now in service to that thing that I'm excited to do in the future, so that we're not, skipping steps along the way. All right. I've forgotten if we have anything left on here, but you can, the key one.
Where we all want to be.
So ultimately, we're trying to pull people back to the middle, right? In the middle of this model, we have a graphic we're going to show you a little bit later, but to get people to execute what they're doing right now. There's a big mindfulness piece to this. Mindfulness is super popular now. It's about being present, aware, and non-judgmental. So it's being here and doing what's right in front of us without getting pulled away. The other domains are very judgment heavy. It was good, it was bad, it's going to be good, it was terrible in the past, like whatever. It's very judgy. And being able to pull yourself back to the task at hand, despite how we feel about it, is really important. And we're going to talk through some of the characteristics of that as we get into the scenario. I think there's 2 slides left, I think. One is just the model again, which we can zoom past. But I think this piece is the last important piece for us to think about as we're going along. I showed you the model with nice little boxes and descriptors as an educational model. The reality is it's all fluid. And what we're really trying to do is, if we use this heat map as an example, we're trying to help our teams find that ability to live more in the green and less in the red. And hopefully the model helps you understand what those pieces are. But if we plotted minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, whatever it might be, your team's going to move around on this model, and that's fine. That's part of the normal, typical human experience. We just want to improve our ability to cluster those dots as much as possible towards the middle of this model and towards that green space. So Paula, I don't know if you want to flip over to the scenario, and then we can use that to
let's
hammer
test our
things
strategies here. I think we're ready. We got the fundamentals. So this is a microsimulation. It's a brief scenario that we're going to go through together, and then we'll unpack it through the lenses of each of these archetypes. So let's dive in here.
A rapidly evolving and highly sophisticated form of malware is causing unprecedented disruption in global health services. Hospitals across multiple countries are reporting system failures, with life support equipment and digital medical records among the critical systems compromised. This adaptive malware exploits existing vulnerabilities and also learns and self-patches to continue spreading. As a result, entire hospitals are losing access to essential systems, making it impossible to provide critical care, track medical records, or access emergency response data. Authorities are working around the clock to contain this threat, but the malware adapts rapidly, presenting an unparalleled challenge.
Max, this is big. The malware is spreading rapidly. Hospitals nationwide are reporting system outages, compromising life support equipment, and making patient records inaccessible. Even medical imaging equipment is malfunctioning.
It's not just the hospitals. I've spoken with several pharmacies across the country, and they're reporting disruptions with essential prescriptions. What recourse do we have?
All right. So scenario is, tab to next before this goes. So the scenario is, there's been a ransomware attack on a hospital. It is, they've essentially taken personal information, sensitive video in this particular case, and they're holding it for ransom. And at this point, we don't know a lot about this particular scenario, but we've got our 5 archetypes, if you will. Let's unpack how we think each of these would approach this particular problem, and talk about how some might be more favorable than others in a scenario like this. Mike, you want to take us through?
Yeah, sure. So I think, this is a scenario that unfortunately is playing out more and more every day. So this is not something that is nebulous anymore. So I think, we, have encountered this in the real world. So this would be something that I think the people looking into the past would have some real world examples to lean on. So the worriers and regretters, I think would have a few different examples to look back upon. So I think, Kevin, kind of that loss of control and the repeating past events, they might start spiraling a little bit on these types of events.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things we have to think about in these situations is like, what is our motivation in those moments? And I think we have some of that in that objectives line, but I think in the vast majority of these situations, we feel we have more to lose than to gain, right? And in some settings in our world, we don't necessarily, like, that isn't necessarily the case, even though people orient that way. So like coaches in sports are notorious for this. They only worry about the bad things that happen, but they could go out and win the game.
Yeah.
But they just tend to orient towards like, I hope the bad stuff doesn't happen and I need to make sure the bad things don't happen. In these situations, like, the best we can do is the problem ends and goes away, and everything outside of that is various forms of bad. And so that tends to pull us to the more negative side of my model, right? And that's why, Mike, I think you see the worriers and the regretters as probably the most prevalent forms of people in these situations.
Yeah. So typically what we would have in these scenarios is, the teams that would be gathered to respond for this are, trying to gather as much information about the scenario as possible. They're trying to assess the situation. They're looking at, past examples of what has happened. And they're, really trying to make the best decision for going forward. So I think your model, we're talking about personal performance, but the model, I think, can even extend to the team that you're putting together as well. So you can, think of it as you're assembling a team that you might have a worrier, a regretter, a reminiscer, and a dreamer kind of all on your team at once. And that might be your combination to get that high performance team, so you can have a high performance team by leveraging the strengths of those 4 quadrants and driving the decision making by leveraging, because none of the 4 quadrants are inherently bad, right? So there's benefits to each of those areas of focus of those people. So if you have those different types of people in the team, you might have different lenses of looking at the scenario that you can draw upon. So you might have people that might say, oh, that's not affecting us, right away, or the people that will say, oh, probably, all work out in the end. So they're kind of giving you a little bit of that positive side of the, hopeful side of things. And you might have the people that are, the doomsdayers that are, kind of thinking that the whole house is going to come crashing down. And they're, kind of pulling you in opposite directions. But I think, utilizing both strengths from both sides, you can get that high performance team and really kind of get that optimal performance of the scenario.
I have a question, Kevin. What have you seen in terms, because a lot of the scenarios that we're seeing emerge from a risk perspective, there's a high degree of ambiguity. There's not a lot of historical reference to draw upon. How do you see that? And in this particular scenario, we don't know a lot about what's going on at this point. How do you see ambiguity influencing people's responses?
Yes, this is actually an area I've done a fair amount of work in the sports space, but then I didn't even introduce this side of my work, but I also work with medical patients at the University of Washington, and there a lot of our patients have diagnoses with unknown futures and pieces that are out of their control and so forth. And so there's a concept in psychology that's called intolerance of uncertainty. And what that really speaks to, I don't know why we chose intolerance instead of more rosy tolerance, but what it speaks to is, how good is a person or a group of people at coexisting with the uncertainty in their world? And in general, even if you're good at tolerating uncertainty, in general, we see uncertainty or unknown as something that's uncomfortable. And in general, as humans, when we have something in our life that's uncomfortable, we want to make it go away. We want to reduce that discomfort or eliminate that discomfort. And so I often think of this as a continuum. This is actually where the toilet paper slide started before COVID hit and it turned into toilet paper. Is at one end of the continuum is the people who solve the uncertainty by trying to ignore it, right? So these are the ostriches. They put their head in the sand. They try to not pay attention to what's going on, because if I don't think about it, I don't have to sit with the fact that the unknown is so uncomfortable. So I'm just going to avoid it. Now, we all know avoidance doesn't work, right? Because the problem is still there. And when the ostrich picks its head up, the same problems are still there in the world, or probably are worse at that point. The other end of the continuum is people try to grab control of that uncertainty or create the known where the unknown exists. And this is really what worrying is all about. When we worry, we are giving ourselves this, in a weird, odd way, we're giving ourselves this sense of comfort that I am coming up with a solution. I am thinking about what might happen. And so a lot of times we get in these worry loops because we're trying to make ourselves more comfortable. But Paula, as you said, sometimes we just there is no answer. So that worrying isn't actually a valid pursuit of a solution because one doesn't exist. We don't know what the problem is, right? No, so you found my slide. There you go.
I felt like we should share it with people because we keep referring to it. It's a great slide.
So the original version had an ostrich on the left and a worrier on the right, fretting about these things. But this is what you're talking about in this situation is if we don't know what the challenge is and we don't know maybe what the possible solutions are and we can't figure that out in the moment, then we really need to work with what we do know and just sit with the discomfort of not knowing until we can figure that out and not fall in those traps that are at either end of this continuum.
So shall we cut to the next? We didn't even talk about how we would respond at this point to this particular scenario. So and feel free if you want to chime in on the chat or raise your hand. But how would you respond with your team in this particular scenario?
Is that for me or is that for Mike? I was hoping we might hear from. Yeah. So I was hoping not to put you on the spot, Mike, but what are some successful responses that you've seen in this type of situation, and maybe map that on the model that we laid out?
Absolutely. So the most successful teams that I've seen are the ones that, like you said, can kind of break out of the paralysis. So I think people get a little bit scared when faced with such a big nebulous problem. So teams that can address and break down these like big problems into actionable smaller steps, because I think then that like you said, it kind of breaks the problem down so that it doesn't overwhelm, and it allows them to probably like get back to that performance zone faster because it's not such a big leap. So if they can, and I think that's where like the leaders and the coaches can kind of help get you there faster. So from a leadership perspective, or like, I think that's where, as a team leader, you have the opportunity to help your team, break down the problem into smaller bites. You can help them get back to the performance zone faster because you're helping them with that overwhelming hurdle, where I think people get a little bit paralyzed from whatever quadrant they're in. If you're off on like dreaming land where I like to live, sometimes, it's like pulling them back down to earth about like, let's get some actual, tangible things accomplished. Or if they're, stuck worrying, it's like, no, let's not worry about this. Let's like do 3 things to get you, 3 steps ahead of where you are today. So I think, really kind of making sure that you have a plan in place ahead of time helps you break down problems before when they happen. So having frameworks in place ahead of time before things like this happens, and I think that's really where a lot of the, where we work as an industry is having, making sure that we've done some of this thinking ahead of time before things happen, but making sure that the frameworks that we have in place are flexible enough so that, as Paula said, the problems we're facing are different, but the way that we approach the problems, it can be the same. So like having the way that we break down the problems as they come in, how do we assess the situation? How do we gather information? What teams do we assemble? Those types of things we can plan ahead of time. We can have the systems in place. We can have the technology in place to aid the teams to make them more efficient and more collaborative when those things happen. All of that we can have in place ahead of time. The problems are going to keep rolling in, and they're going to get more and more creative. Thanks to AI, they're going to be even more inventive and more rapid pace. The velocity is increasing. I think that's going to be a challenge that we've sort of opened Pandora's box, and there's probably no going back. But I think if we have these frameworks in place, and now you have me thinking about how to incorporate this type of model into how we can, incorporate that into our checklist, into how we build our teams, making sure that we're putting in these types of thoughtful checkpoints along the way into our checklist of like, are we assessing how people are feeling or how people are just making decisions based on the quadrants. I think that will be very helpful, with the problem-solving checklist going forward.
That's reminding me of a couple things we've done in these situations with some of the businesses that I've worked with. And, one piece, like you're saying, you were using the phrase framework. We often use the phrase process, but the idea is have some anchors that you can come back to that get you back on track. And one of the things we've looked at with a lot of teams is, if we're anchoring on our process, is your process actually pulling you into the middle of the model? So is your process consistent with who you are at your best? And when people see that it is, that's really motivating, right? That makes it easier to trust that we're relying on a process that's going to produce the best outcome. When it feels like we have just a process or a framework that somebody created one day because it's what they felt like was the right thing to do, it's hard for us to feel like that's going to be something that's productive for us. So from my end of the business as a psychologist, I look with people at this idea of, is your process a facilitator of being who you want to be in that moment? And if it is, then we really try to lean on that process as the anchor that pulls us back from those outer ranges. The other thing a lot of people I've worked with have ended up doing with the model is built some kind of assessment process that helps them evaluate where their individuals are or where their team is on that model. So I use this model with a football team, and they literally started tracking this during the game so they could adjust their play calling to get the team back in a better space to be successful as the game went on. Or I did this with a group of lawyers who was using this to evaluate where they were going as the different things were happening in the case, the different filings were happening, the different the different legal maneuvers and so forth, and how they felt they were moving, the other side was moving, the judge was moving, and so forth. So using it as an assessment tool that extends beyond kind of the nuts and bolts of your craft and looks at like what are the potential traps we are or are not falling into as well. So I like both of those pieces that you brought up.
One thing that's interesting about this particular scenario is the element of contagion. And I think that brings up another principle that I think you get to in the toilet paper analogy, funnily enough, but it is like when we're working with a third party, whether it's a vendor, whether it's a customer, whether it's a stakeholder, et cetera, there's you don't have as much control over those sorts of situations. How does that lens of control really impact your ability to really shape how people are thinking about these sorts of responses?
I think we can all relate that when we feel out of control, we struggle, right? Like we feel almost like we're running on ice at that point. And so, I think it is really important to try to improve a person or a team's sense of control in a moment. And some of that, and this is going to sound backwards, but some of it is actually like narrowing the scope of the role. So if you're using an outside vendor and you don't have control over that piece, it's making sure people do know what they do have control over so that they can lock in on that piece and invest on the pieces that are within their control. Because when we feel uncomfortable because we're out of control, we tend to get pulled away by that piece. We get pulled away by that discomfort and trying to resolve that discomfort. And so I think we have that there on the bottom of this slide. Like one of the things that's really helpful is increasing control by defining roles, by defining responsibilities. The New England Patriots, whether you like them or not, they were famous for this kind of do your job mentality for a number of years. And the idea being that if everybody understood their role, they could invest fully in that role and they could trust that everybody else was doing the same. And that took care of kind of stripping away a lot of that discomfort that comes from the pieces that are outside of your control.
And I think kind of the reverse side of that too is as the world becomes more and more reliant on these third-party relationships, it's, I think from previously we would always do kind of assessments and we would, send out questionnaires and, ask for information, and the third party would send back, yep, we do all of these things, and they would send back the nice checklist and say yes to everything, and then something bad would happen. And we would say, well, you said you did this. So yeah, I think, we can trust these, third-party vendors, and we can have contractual arrangements, but I think really, the trust but verify kind of attitude is more and more prevalent. And I see a lot more of, my customers that I work with are kind of, gravitating that way, where they're, having them join them in joint exercising, where they, they're participating in some of their, failover activities, or, large scale exercising, where they're, really kind of becoming part of the team. And going through the motions with the internal team, so that they really experience what would happen in the crisis like this, so that they're they're really participating, and they're putting that actually in their contracts now, where they are required to participate in an exercise like that once a year, or things of that nature. So I think we're going to start to see more and more of that going forward, of that people are going to want to have that level of trust as we become more and more inter-reliant on all of these different organizations.
Yeah, I know, Mike, you and I have been working on some things, we'll call it like a scrimmage, right? Like just put people in the game, like 6-year-old soccer team,
Yep.
throw them out in the field, see how they do. And then you're able to assess kind of where you fall in that. And I think that's, for us as individuals, as leaders, right? We're putting ourselves in the moment. How would I respond? What are the emotions that I'm feeling in the moment? How am I thinking about this? Like in a realistic setting really influences the way that like really coaches you in a sense to think about this differently should that a like event happen in the future. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of boards, leadership teams, third parties, as you mentioned, Mike, but really across the organization with as much disruption, with as much change as we're seeing around the world, putting people in the moment, letting them experience it as if it was actually happening, kind of negates some of the chilling effect of decision making that you see when people are in crisis, or when people are under pressure. I'm super curious though, Kevin, how have you seen this play out either in a clinical setting or in your sports setting, the importance of role play and practice?
So I think it's an interesting one because I think there's a lot of effective elements to the role play, the scrimmage, and so forth, but only if people attach to the actual event, right? So if it's just like this activity that we have to do and it doesn't feel meaningful, right? Then it isn't productive. But when people can connect that to the task that they need to do, or they can connect it to building confidence in an area where they were trying to build confidence, then it starts to be really effective. And that's where, like, not to hinge everything on this model, but that's where the knowing the performing square piece is really important. If you know what you want to be about, then things like role play, things like scrimmage, things like practice runs, those can be ways that you work on being who you want to be in that performing square. And then it becomes meaningful because now we're getting practice reps at something that's important to us. So I think it takes, from my perspective, it takes doing that extra work to help people see why it's meaningful, why it's important for them, how it's going to be helpful for what they're trying to accomplish. And then when we do that, it's a great opportunity for learning and for growing and for getting better at what we want to be doing.
So I know we're running. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say too, you've been making me think of kind of like how to approach, people on my team or the teams that, the high performance teams I want to work with and build, is really kind of thinking about how to approach people that might gravitate to one of the, the 4 quadrants, or even myself, of, thinking about like what capabilities these people naturally might have, and what motivates them. And then thinking about kind of what are the skills and tools that each of them might need to kind of gravitate them back to that center space. So kind of thinking about how to approach each one of them, because they need different things to kind of get back to that center square. So I think that's going to be my homework tonight, to kind of start thinking about the different lists of things for my teams.
Well, I think it's matchmaking too, right? As leaders, if we know that, these individuals sort of their disposition leans more toward, worrying, maybe pair them with someone that is more future focused, it would really, complement their perspective. Thanks, everybody, and have a wonderful day.